Hi folks, you've Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the insanity in Australia amongst the political class, and indeed the investment class as well, the big ticket investor class, to say the super high rents in Australia, which is all happening all across the Western world, by the way. Every country suffering mass migration has pretty much got the same problem. That rents have skyrocketed way beyond wages, and places that just a few years ago you could rent for $300 a week are now costing $800 or $900 a week. Places that were $250 a week even 6 years ago, 7 years ago, are now renting close to $1,000 a week, and so on. So it's a very different landscape. I mean, the same could be said for property prices as well, but just focusing on rents for the moment. And a lot of people are hurting by this, and a lot of people are having to. So if you look at and I've mentioned this before. If you just get an ordinary in a lower end suburb, just an ordinary 1-bedroom apartment, and compare it to the average wage, it takes something around 65% plus of the average wage to pay the rent. Now, compared to say the 1970s, when to rent an apartment would be 20% of the average wage. So the cost of rent has increased at more than three times the average wage. So that just sort of illustrates, I think, with great clarity, it costs 300% more out of your wages to rent a place today than it did in the 1970s. And the places today are, given the amount of apartments. But anyway, I wanted to particularly focus on, it's interesting how the politicians, the political class, are just shrugging their shoulders. Nothing to see here. Somehow all these mad, insane rent increases, it's just natural, it's organic. What's unusual? What's your problem? Now, people focus on two things, or primarily, three things, I guess. Firstly is mass migration. Now, given the amount of people coming in each year, we're talking students, migrants, it's 400,000 plus that they're bringing in. And even if you assume that, firstly, nearly all of those are renters, and you assume they're going to pack themselves in like sardines, it's not unusual to see 20 Indian students in a 2-bedroom apartment, for example. And, some of them even bring over other family members and girlfriends and all this sort of thing. So they can pack them in pretty tight, but on average, if you look at sort of the average, say Indian Chinese type place, that there would be, say, 12 people to a 2-bedroom apartment, and a little bit less if they're more affluent. Now, the apartments are smaller as you get in towards the city. More 1-bedrooms, more compact, more sort of flatette or bed sit type apartments. So there's fewer people in those. Nonetheless, when COVID was sort of hitting its strides big time, over 2 million people, students and short-term work visa folks, left Australia. They're supposed to be around 2.5 million, left Australia and went back to like India and China and so on. So you'd think, even if you assume 10 people per room, there's still 25,000 apartments that are being vacated there, and that should cause quite a, because there's no new people coming in because it's COVID, of course. That should have created quite a boost in supply and quite a dip in rental prices. The way it used to work with rentals is that you would ask for a rental price you thought you could get, and if you're on the market for too many weeks and you had no takers, you drop the price. And I remember in my sort of younger years going around renting places, if the real estate agent, and they used to take you out personally to do the inspection, the real estate agent would say, look, this place has been up for rent for a couple of months now. And it could be just the off season, middle of winter, so I don't So look, the rent we're asking is back in the day, the rent we're asking is $40 a week, but we're quite happy to talk $30 if you're willing to sign up today, that sort of thing. So you could cut deals on the spot. Now, and I remember looking at one apartment, and for some reason it stuck in my head. It was a fully furnished 2-bedroom apartment, so you didn't need to bring any furniture. It had, pots, pans, crockery, and everything, fully furnished, and TV, everything. And it was $40 a week. And that was it. So that was the sort. This was in the later 1970s, but that's the sort of. And it was walk to the shopping centre, walk to the beach, this sort of stuff. So it was that was the sort of stuff you could get now. I look at those sort of apartments today, and they're again, pushing $1,000 a week. So now I just want to sort of focus on the numbers here, because there were a number. There's quite a few supposed studies that come out, and they're just pure propaganda. They're just there to justify the political class and their position, to say nothing to see here. That's all these things are. So they say, well, mass migration doesn't really affect rents or rent demand. It's hey, what's your problem? It's no big deal. Any Nazis would say that. So it's just the people. It's just the Nazis who don't like mass migration. It's just them making up stories. Now, how they can do this, because the entire political class accept that rents have gone up and supply of rental property is at a minimum, particularly as you get closer into the city. It's not so bad if you're out in the middle of, in the far outer suburbs or that sort of thing, or if you're away from major transport links. For example, the rents in the area that we're in aren't as brutal. Listening to people I've been talking to anyway, but it's still relatively brutal. From 10 years ago, the rents would have been, a quarter of what they are now. So it's still, but on a relative basis to the city, you can get a 3-bedroom freestanding house for the same price as an apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment that might be close in the city. So you've got that type of differential. Nonetheless, the politicians and the real estate, particularly the real estate lobby, who are quite powerful in Australia, they're saying no big deal, no. So the first thing is mass migration. I'll come back to that in a minute in the statistics. The second thing is vast offshore buying of property. Offshore property investors buying up hundreds upon hundreds of properties. They don't necessarily buy it directly. They use local nominees. Because with these Indians and China, they've all got, their 10th cousin is considered to be someone who owes them loyalty and fealty and so on to the head of the wider sort of clan or family. So they'll happily act as surrogates and go out buying property and so you get crazy things like an illiterate Chinese cleaner who only works a few days a week as a cleaner, and he's got a $10 million property portfolio. I mean, no one seems to think that's strange, but there you go. So there's mass offshore buying of property. And again, whether it's offshore directly or using local nominees, it hardly matters. It's still offshore buying. And the third thing in Australia, there's a lot of tax write-offs you can get for owning a property, and you can write those tax. You can defray the tax you do pay on other income. So you can create a group of companies, and one of those companies makes a profit, and all the rest own property, and then you can shuffle that around and say that as you're losing money on the property, you can then defray that against tax you pay on the other company. And the Chinese and the Indians, in particularly the Chinese, but the Indians too, are very adept at this. And there's also local people. There's people I know that own 30, 40, 50 properties, white Australians. And, there again, it's a scam, in effect, that they're allowed to write off the tax on that many property. I mean, sure, if you've got 1 or 2 properties, maybe it's an investment for your kids or something like that. But the idea that you can have a huge property portfolio and receive special tax write-off benefits because of it, that's bullshit. Because then you get people with large amounts of capital moving in, and they just price out property is no longer a place where you live. It's an investment vehicle that you can use for all sorts of tax avoidance and tax minimisation and so on. But I want to come back to the details on on the claims that these people going overseas, just the height of now rents were at record levels before COVID hit and when COVID hit. So rents were already at record levels at that point. They've got worse since, but they were at record levels then, which you have to remember is like 5 years ago now, or say 4.5 years ago is when COVID started to really ramp up. Now there are many students here, millions of students and people on temp work visas, all that sort of thing, and they pretty much all left the country to go back to again India or China. But here's the rub. Now 2.5 million people leave the country. Most of those are renting, and yet rental vacancies stayed more or less the same. In fact, they slightly went down. So wait a minute, the demand, all these people leaving and there are less, but so clearly people are hoarding properties. They were just deciding, I can't get the money I want, so I'll just hoard the properties. I'll just take them off the market. And that was allowed. Now they can do that because they've got a tax write-off. So if they're not collecting rent, but they've got a cash flow elsewhere, they can continue to make the payments on the apartment. Maybe they own them outright, but they continue to make the payments to the bank, the mortgage payments on that. But those payments then become a loss that they can use to write off against tax from other income. So these are people who've got near monopoly control over their income. Their income is so reliable and dependable, they don't have to worry about it. So they can happily take the pain of not collecting rent on properties. I mean, how many people can do that? Private investors can't. So they've got to be big money end of town. Only they could afford to do this. So when all these millions of people left Australia, the amount of properties for rent, this includes freestanding properties, apartments, and they actually went back a little bit. Not a huge amount, but nonetheless went back. So now there were some slight increase in vacancies in areas, suburbs, say, with forests of high-rise apartments. As far as the eye can see, just one high-rise apartment block after the other. There were but minor. They didn't go up that much. Now the rent prices held steady, but didn't really go down. What landlords, when your property owners were doing, was rather than reduce the price of the rent, which you would normally do in a market-driven economy, but they would offer inducements like you get the first week free or the first fortnight free, and then you pay rent thereafter. But there was as far, and I kept stats on this. I've got the spreadsheets the receipts to prove it. The rents barely dropped back at all. Rent that was 500 maybe went down to 480. That type of thing. But basically no movement. Now, okay, 2.5 million people, most of whom are renters, leave Australia, and the amount of property for rent stays pretty stable, goes down a little bit. It doesn't increase. Now, you'd think that 30,000 properties there or more would just suddenly have come onto the market quickly, but that wasn't the case. It didn't happen. Why not? Why are these people not renting? Are they living, 100 to a room or something? So I mean, what's going on here? And why would not only the amount of properties for rent not increase, why would they go back slightly? This doesn't make any sense at all statistically. There should have been a huge increase in the amount of properties for rent, and rent prices should have sharply dropped back with that much extra stock up for rent, but that didn't happen. Neither the amount of properties for rent didn't increase, and the amount of and the rental prices didn't drop back, or if they did, it was by a fraction, 1 or 2%, that type of level. So this doesn't add up, and I'll come back to sort of some analysis in a minute. Now, when COVID went and millions of renters from overseas renters came back in the market, it didn't really drop. So say 15, out of across all of Australia, the difference between the peak COVID amount and the as all the people began to return, the students, say up till just over a year ago, the amount of properties for rent didn't fall by a whole lot. It sort of, they're in the same trajectory as they are today. It's in that same range. So for some reason, millions of renters leave the country, millions of renters come into the country, and somehow there's movement, but not much. Now the rents increased sharply when all the people started coming back, but the amount of stock dropped somewhat, but not much. So clearly we're looking at something else here. There are people hoarding places for rent until they can get the big bucks they want. There must be, hundreds of thousands of empty places around the country. Places that should be available for use, but they're not. They're not being rented out. They're being just sat on. So we're looking at what here, a rigged, savagely, brutally rigged and fixed market in the amount of stock available, the amount of rental properties available, and the prices being charged. There is a vice-like grip of monopolists and cartel pricing here. Now, let's add to this the difference of the amount of new properties coming into the market. So the government claims that they're building between 150 and 180,000 new properties every year, and have done for several years. Why is that having no effect? Are all these places being purchased and are people living in them? That doesn't. There are tower blocks of apartments where hardly anyone seems to live in them. Are people from overseas buying them and just leaving them there as they just money laundering or something like that? You'd think that there'd be a proportion of these houses would come into these properties, mostly apartments. You're thinking a proportion of those would come onto the rental scene and be available for rent, but they don't appear to be. So why are all these new properties, so few, being available to rent? Now, there are a number of drivers to rental price. The rental property companies and the rental management companies send out circulars to all property owners and say, you know what, your property, you should be charging this amount for rent or that amount for rent. Now, whether that reflects any market forces or something, but these companies, these businesses that do that, they effectively drive the market. So they say, well, you know what, you should be charging $1,000 a week for that place. Why? Well, we say so, and so they're very much in bed with the property developers. Now, as long as rents are increasing at a clip, which they are, then buying property for investment should be a no-brainer. It's a guaranteed income earner. I mean, you can't lose when rents are going out like this. But somehow, again, the amount of new property owners coming in and then putting products up for rental, that's not increasing. That's holding more or less steady. So again, we're looking at a rigged and fixed market here. Now, when you consider that politicians now, more than half their income comes from, and this is new, it didn't used to be this way, comes from property speculation, investment, and so on. So they've really got no interest in it. The big financial firms, the big real estate lobby, the big builders and developers, there are so many people now at the elite level, a tiny proportion of the population that are getting very rich out of this, and they're fine with it. And if the plebeians, the plebs have to live, spend 2/3 of their income on renting some shitbox apartment, well, that's their lookout. They're only the shit on my shoes anyway, they would say. But that's the thing. So the lies, I mean, it's incredibly saddening when you think that the politicians, not only do they not care about the voters, they're in open contempt and will tell any lie they want to escape culpability and accountability on this. All the politicians represent the globalists now, the globalist cabal. They don't represent the people. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.